So now that we learned how to build these various fun shapes, I want to go over how to read dimensions on an isometric view and then build it in your 3D modeling software. And so let's start with shape 1 from our list of shapes. And I've actually got a bigger image of it over here. Let me move my Fusion 360 screen a little bit smaller. And then to give myself more room to work, I'm going to go ahead and close out my data panel. You can always open it back up if you want to, but this just gives me a little bit more room to work. And then I can also see my shape 1 while I'm working. And I want to start with this front face of shape 1, this sort of L-shaped face. And so let's go to Create Sketch. Let's make sure we select our front view. And I'm going to make this bottom left corner here our origin. And so I'm going to grab my line tool, and I'm going to place it on my origin. And what does it do? Well, it goes to the right 2.25. And so I'm going to drag it horizontally to the right, and I'm going to type on my keyboard 2.25. And I don't want to hit enter on my keyboard. I want to click my mouse. And then I'm going to drag up. And well, what does it do next? Well, it goes straight up. Well, how far does it go up? It doesn't really tell us right here, but if we look at the back of the shape, the height is 0.75. It doesn't stop being 0.75 in the front, so we know the height. I'm just going to drag it up so I have a vertical line, and I'll type in 0.75. And once again, I'm not going to hit enter on my keyboard. I'm going to click my mouse. Then I want to drag it to the left because that's what it does next. But it doesn't tell us how far it goes to the left. And instead of trying to figure it out, I'm just going to drag it to the left and click on some random distance, and I'll figure it out in a second. So I'll click, and then it goes straight up. So I will go straight up some distance, and I'm going to drag it to the left until I get to this green line right above my origin. I want it to be on the green line, and I want it to be horizontal before I click. And then finally, I will just connect to my origin. Let's hit right click and cancel to get out of our line tool. And if we look, we have an almost fully dimensioned shape. But there are 2 blue lines left that we can change. We can change this height, and we can change this width. And let's start with this height. Well, this height is 1.5 inches tall, and so that's really easy. I'm going to grab my dimension tool, and whoops, it looks like it automatically selected that line. Let's try to figure out why. If I right click and hit cancel, it looks like I already have that line selected. So if that happens when you hit dimension, it automatically starts dimensioning that line. I'm going to right click and cancel again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect that line by clicking somewhere on my screen. And then I'll grab my dimension tool. And I want to dimension from the bottom to the top. So I'll go from the bottom to the top, and I'll give that a dimension of 1.5. And then we only have 1 left. And does it tell us this width? Well, it doesn't tell us here, and it doesn't tell us here. But if we go back up to this top edge of our part and we look at the back of it, we can see the width is 0.75. It doesn't stop being 0.75 in the front. This width of this part of our shape is 0.75. So with my dimension tool selected, I want to click on these 2 lines and tell it to be 0.75. Hit enter on my keyboard, and we have a fully constrained sketch. And you might be wondering, well, Mr. Anderson, what about this line right here? We didn't type in this dimension. Well, if you think about it, we don't need it. If the entire width is 2.25 and this smaller width is 0.75, then this width has to be 1.5. There's no way to get around it. In fact, if you try to, it will give you an over-constraining warning. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. We cannot change the length of this dimension if we already know the total in this partial. The same is true for the height. 0.75 plus 0.75, I'm going to right click and hit cancel, is 1.5. And so if we know this little height and we know the total height, we know this other small height. You can't change the dimensions that they are because math. And so now we have this front face sketched out. I'm going to go ahead and finish my sketch and find the extrude button. And I want to drag it back. Well, how far back does it go? And if you look, it might be hard to see at first, but if we go from the very front of our shape to the very back of our shape, you can see these extension lines coming out of the very front and the very back connected by this dimension of 1.5 inches. So that is our total depth from the very front to the very back. And so I'm going to type in a dimension of 1.5 and hit OK. And it might be hard to see that at first, but you need to learn how to recognize what each dimension is. And the little trick I like to do is I like to cross off dimensions as I use them. So for example, I use this width already. I don't want to reuse it somewhere else. I already used this height, so I don't need it again. I already used this height. That was this height of this edge and this edge right here. And we already used this width. That was this width. Well, it was this width, but this width is the same width. And so that's this 0.75. And then, of course, we used our depth of 1.5. And if you look, this shape is starting to resemble shape 1. It just doesn't have these two big holes cut out of it. And so let's go ahead and do that. And I want to start with this hole right here. If I look at my right side face, I can see there's this rectangular hole cut out of it. So what I want to do is click on this right side face and go to Create New Sketch. And let's put a rectangle on it. Let's grab our rectangle tool and let's place it down in between this line and this line, just somewhere in the middle. Drag it in. And why did I go in between these two? Well, if I go to my isometric view, you can see that, well, this edge and this edge are the same edge when we're looking at it from the side view. That might be hard to see from here. But I don't want to sketch it on this face. The hole is cut out of this face, and so I want it to be here. And instead of grabbing my dimension tool and adding the dimensions of this box, what I'm going to do instead is I want to go find one of our constraints. So let's click on our Constraints tab, and I want to go down to Collinear. And what does collinear do? Well, co means like co-worker, like working together, and linear is, of course, line. So lines working together are two lines becoming the same line. I'm going to select it, and I want to tell this top line to be the same as this top edge. And so now they are connected together. If I go to my right side view, you can see the exact same thing from another view. And in fact, I like to go back and forth between my home view and my 2D view to kind of make sure I understand what I'm doing, what I'm looking at here. But you can see this hole is clearly going to have the same dimensions as the height of this side of our face. So why put the dimension down again when you can just borrow the previous dimension you used using your collinear constraint? And so with my collinear constraint still selected, I want to select the bottom line of my rectangle to the bottom edge. And so now I've given myself 2 of my 4 dimensions of my rectangle. I'm going to right click and hit cancel. And if we look, we can drag these 2 lines. We still need to figure out these 2 widths. Let me click off to deselect that line. What are these widths? And it might be obvious to you, but just in case it's not, I want to go back to my home view to make it a little bit more clear. The location of this line as compared to this edge is 0.5. So I'm going to grab my dimension tool, and I'm going to click on this edge and this edge, and I'm going to drag it down, and I want it to be 0.5. And so if I look at it from the right side view, it should make sense. You should be able to rotate this in your head and see it, but just in case, like I said, I like to go back and forth to make sure I see what's going on. And so what about this line? Well, if we follow it, it is also 0.5 from this line to this edge. We can see that's right there. So with my dimension tool selected, I'll click on this line and this edge and drag it down and type in 0.5 and hit enter. And you can see how these dimensions are the exact same as these dimensions. And you might say, well, Mr. Anderson, what about the distance between these 2 lines right here? Well, just like before, we already said the total depth was 1.5. So if this is 50 cents or 0.5, and this is 0.5 or 50 cents, then this distance has to be 0.5 as well, because the 3 add up to 1.5. And so that's why we have a fully constrained sketch without adding that dimension. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my sketch and make sure I'm in my home view. And I'll select my extrude tool, and I want to click on this rectangle. And instead of extruding it out, I wanted to extrude it in and cut. And how far do we want to cut? Well, if you look, it extrudes inward 0.75. And so I'll type in 0.75. And oh, it looks like it went the wrong direction. Let's see if we can reverse that. If I drag it back in, it looks like we get a negative number. So I do need to type in negative 0.75 to make sure it goes to the left and not to the right. And we have that hole cut out. Let me go ahead and cross off those dimensions so I don't confuse myself later, just in case. And so if we look, how many dimensions do we have left? We have 1, 2, 3, 4 dimensions given to us left to help us cut out this final hole. And if you look, it is a rectangular hole cut out of this right side face right here. So let's left click on that and go to create new sketch. And let's grab our rectangle tool again. And this time, instead of drawing it in the middle of the face, I'm going to make it automatically collinear by making sure I start it on this top edge. And so I'll go towards the top left, not all the way to the corner, but towards the top left, and drag it down anywhere in the middle and click again. And if I go to my home view, hopefully you can see what I just did. I sketched out the 2D version of this rectangular hole. And it's missing a few constraints, so let's grab our dimensioning tool. And the first one is obvious. The distance between this line and this edge is 0.25. And so I'm going to select this line and this edge, and let's drag it out. Let's tell it to be 0.25 and hit enter on our keyboard. And you can see where this dimension comes from. And so that dimension should be obvious from the isometric view. It might be a little less obvious from the right side view, but I would like you to familiarize yourself with how to see it from the side view, how to rotate this in your mind to see what this would look like from the side view. So for example, what would be the dimension between these two edges from here to here? Well, if we follow these edges all the way to the end, we can see the extension lines coming out. It is clearly this 0.25. And if it's hard to see, let me type it in and then go to my home view and see if I can make it a little bit more clear. Do you see how this distance is this distance, and that's the same as this distance with these two extension lines coming out of it being 0.25. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on my keyboard to get this dimension as well. And if you look, we have one more constraint to give, and that is the location constraint of this last blue line. And you might be tempted to connect it from here to here. We don't actually know that dimension. It doesn't actually tell us, and the only way we could figure it out is by doing a little bit of math. So instead, let's just follow this edge. And if we follow it to our extension line, we can see that between these two edges is a distance of 1. And so I'm going to connect these two edges with a distance of 1 inch and hit enter on our keyboard. And now we have a fully constrained sketch. And so I'm going to go ahead and cross off these dimensions that I used. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Anderson, what about this dimension right here? We never used this 0.5. Well, that is the distance between these two lines right here. And if I click on them, we can even drag it out, but it'll tell us that it's over constraining because we don't actually need it. Of course, this would be 0.5 because if this whole height is 0.75 and this is 0.25, 25 cents plus 50 cents is 75 cents. And so we don't actually need that dimension to finish constraining the sketch, although you can put it down. It won't hurt anything. It's just over constraining. We can't change the value of that number. But from here, I have a fully constrained rectangle. I'm going to right-click and hit Cancel and finish my sketch. And I want to extrude this hole all the way through. I'm going to change it from a distance to all and hit OK. And we are now done with shape 1. I'm going to go ahead and go to my Save button and type in shape 1 and hit Save. And if I check in my data panel, we can see that shape 1 is now saved in my shapes folder of my engineering lessons project.